Let's get sweaty.
Hey guys, welcome to a new Shenmue Dojo interview. It's been a long time since I've done one of these, and apologies for taking such a long time to get another interview in, but hopefully you enjoy this one. So this interview today is focused in around a new fan of the Shenmue series. Basically, we went in and started talking about Shenmue 3, and is it really as bad as people make out to be for new fans? Well, my guest today, Bailey Caldwell, discusses that very fact with me, and we have a look at the Shenmue story and more in this 45-minute interview. So, Bailey, welcome to the dojo on this fine Saturday. How you doing?
I am doing great today. How are yourself?
I am really good, despite the typical British weather, which is completely and utterly shockingly wet. But that's just normal for over here. Thank you for joining me, Bailey. It's much appreciated. I know we've spoken a little bit on social media. Obviously, I invited you on to talk about Shenmue 3 a little bit and your experiences with it and Shenmue in general. But first, I do this with everybody on the show. Before diving into the Shenmue stuff, could you talk me through a little bit of your gaming history, consoles, favorite games, that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the show. It's very exciting. I've watched you guys for a long time, and I appreciate the chance here. So I've been gaming for longer than I can really remember, honestly. Yeah, I woke up with a controller in my hand, pretty much. And interestingly enough, I was born November 8th, 2000, which you might know as the American release of Shenmue. So that game has been around for as long as I can remember, too. As a matter of fact, an interesting story. My brother, when I was being born, was apparently like inconsolably upset. No, there's another one? No. How can this be? And he got to have one present. His present, Shenmue. So he showed that to me. We eventually connected. He didn't hate me so much. And it's funny. Shenmue's in a way what brought us together a little closer. So yeah, that's how that game is a big part of my life. The first game. The second game I did not have much experience with until the HD re-releases. Actually, I was not able to import it. Obviously, just that was a major issue. Never had an Xbox, so couldn't play it. And then when I did play Shenmue 2, I had a much different experience with it than I think many people growing up might have had and looking back at it nostalgically.
Okay, so talk me through that a little bit, because obviously when I played Shenmue 2 back in the day, and I'm talking 2001 here, it was mind-blowing is the way I
Yeah.
would describe it for me. How was it for you, sort of coming into it from a different angle?
Now, pretty much all of my comparisons for Shenmue 2 is to the first game, more than I guess I should fairly look at it for the time, and obviously it is mind blowing. I mean, the mile wide world, and it feels so massive, especially for the time, for sure. And the level of detail is comparable to the first game, maybe not as deep. Like the characters don't have their own routines in the same way, but still wildly impressive for the time. But for me, comparing it to Shenmue 1, there's just something less charming and personable about it, which is probably the point from a story perspective. You're supposed to be lost in this big world, but it's obviously a bit harder to get into. Actually, my problem with Shenmue 2 is what a lot of people have a problem with Shenmue 3, in the fact that I feel it starts you on a grind very immediately. I mean, you start off stacking those books just to stay at her house. Before that, you're getting money for rent, and it introduces the aspects of the world very smoothly, but it is an immediate forcing you into these side activities.
Yeah, I can absolutely get that. And when you think you get your bag nicked in the first 5 minutes of the game with all your money in it, you're straight
Yeah.
into that grind, aren't you?
Obviously, I've grown to love Shenmue 2. I love all three games just about evenly because I feel they all have their equal strengths and detractions. But obviously, we all love them.
Yeah, that's fair. So, having read your Facebook post, you talked about playing Shenmue 1 quite a lot, being very familiar with it, and Shenmue 2 never really clicking with you until very recently. What made you go back to it and look at it with a fresh coat of paint, if you like?
Um, so I generally play games on a laptop. I emulate
Hmm.
everything and go back to that. But recently, the charger for that laptop died on me, so I have not been able to play games that I would like to play, more recent titles. And I dusted off this old Intel barely processor, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it's given me more motive to go back and play these older titles that I've missed out on. And the first one that I went to, Shenmue 2, one has always been really special, and I always felt bad for missing out on it. I always hear, "Oh, two is the better game. That's the one you need to play." And I was like, "Oh, I guess I have to check that one out, obviously." And then I guess that leads us into the discussion around three, which is that's the bad one. That's the one you should avoid. I don't necessarily feel that's fair.
No, no, I don't. In fairness, either, and we'll segue into Shenmue 3 then a little bit. Obviously, again from your Facebook post, you played number two. You grabbed Shenmue 3, I think, in a sale on the PlayStation Store. I think it was $5 or $6. You said at the time. Obviously, you then posted up and said, right, what are the fan views on Shenmue 3? Straight up, did any of the responses surprise you around it? And did any potentially put you off of playing it or would have stopped you playing it potentially?
So, were I a different gamer who wasn't just dead set, I'm going to play this game, like I need to play this game, it's Yu Suzuki's next entry, I'm going to play it.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
if I was just a casual gamer and I saw those reviews, yeah, I would not play that game. uh, it was widely negative. And all with comparisons to the old games, not even necessarily from a modern gaming mindset. They're negative from a Shenmue fan perspective, which is just really surprising to me. That's not. I don't feel like that tracks given how the game plays. I'm not looking at it nostalgically or from any of those perspectives. I just think if you play one right after the next, it's a perfect pickup.
Yeah, I would agree with that actually. When you think of because about a year ago, I played 1, 2, and 3 back to back. I just felt like doing it. And you're right. When you finish two, you pick up three. I don't know. It just flows nicely. It's probably one of the biggest compliments I can give it. Is it just flows into three, and you're away with it. Um, what were your expectations before we sort of dive into the mechanics of three, the storytelling, and all of it? What were your expectations around Shenmue 3? Did you have any?
Yeah, so I've already seen many reviews surrounding the game, and my expectations were to not necessarily enjoy it. The only thing I wasn't particularly excited was for the new combat system
Yeah.
that's been widely lambasted, and definitely have some thoughts on that. I don't think it's the big negative people portray it as, but we'll get into that later. Anyway, my major expectation was that it's gonna play almost exactly like the old ones, which is what I wanted. I think when it came out, when it was announced and being released, people expected it to maybe be modernized, change up from the old games, which is understandable. That's not necessarily what I ever wanted, and maybe that's why I'm a bit more positive towards the game.
Sort of going in with not massive expectations, but expecting it to play like a Shenmue game, which I think is probably a fair expectation to have. You fire it up for the first time. What's your initial reaction to actually getting your hands on it and playing it before we sort of dive into the nitty gritty content around the game itself?
I actually think that the introductory hour of the game is probably the most harmful aspect of the entire title. And
Hmm.
I can honestly understand where a lot of the issues that people have with the game directly come from this introductory hour. It starts off with the first conversation with you and Shenhua, and the very first piece of voice acting you're introduced to in the entire game is Brittany, and unfortunately, I completely think it's the direction rather than her as a performer, because I do find her endearing through most of the title. I find almost all of the characters in this game to be well voice acted in the sense of you really get a feel for them as a character, even though occasionally the lines can be maybe stilted.
Yeah.
But this very first conversation is so awkward and Shenhua, and we all love it. We've all grown to find it charming in some way or another, but it's definitely it's one way to start a game. If you play it with the Japanese subtitles, the lip sync is less awkward and definitely
Yeah.
a slight bit easier to take seriously. It's just unfortunate. It's the way it is. So further from that, you're immediately introduced to the stamina system. So the first thing that you have to do is buy things and get money. In theory, I think the
Yeah.
game actually starts you out with enough money to get going. I never found it too terribly annoying, especially since my first instinct in a Shenmue game is typically I gotta go find something to do to fill time. It was never a big change to me in Shenmue 3. It was just kind of made into an official gameplay loop rather than some side activities that you can perhaps go and do. After that, you're tutorialized on the combat, which is perhaps one of the worst tutorials I've ever played. And I understand what he was going for completely. He wanted to open it up to new players of the series, but just press any button. It's pretty silly. It doesn't actually show the combat system for what it is, which is a combo fest and a pretty fun one.
Yeah, agree. I completely agree with that on the combat system. Press any buttons. When you get into it, and we'll talk about this a bit more detail. The combat system actually has some depth to it, and it's quite clever. But it doesn't sell itself properly in that first tutorial at all. It's not a good introduction in any way, shape, or form. And I've said that for a long time, so I completely agree with that point.
It's just an unfortunate first hour. It really is a turnoff, and was maybe not excited for the rest of the game, but once it opens up, it really has a lot to offer. Right? I mean, especially when comparing to the previous games, everything is here. You've got maybe more mini games, more fleshed out. The sights are gorgeous to see. Bailu Village is as charming as Dobuita was for me personally. All the characters are memorable. Corey did a great job as Rio. There's a ton to love. It's just this first hour introducing everything is pretty rough around the edges and highlights, I think, a lot of what people talk about as negatives for the entire game.
That's fair. And the first hour, I remember having done an interview with Ryan Payton years ago now. God, it's 3 years ago since I did that, and he was talking how they chopped and changed that first hour of the game, where that opening conversation sort of fades out. You then do a bit of walking, then there's all these fade to blacks, and it all, I don't know, it seems very patched together. That first hour is probably the way I'd put it. But once, like you say, you get past it, and the game opens up, I think you then see the true beauty of Shenmue 3. And like you say, the environments are stunning. There's some really good characters there. The combat system is better than people give it credit for. Let's dive in a little bit to the Shenmue 3 story. I think this is one where a lot of fans who liked it or didn't like it have all said that the story needed more. Where do you stand on that as a new player to Shenmue 3?
So I'm gonna come out and say from the very beginning, Yu Suzuki made it quite clear that this story is going to be a long one. It's going to be going on for a
Yep.
while. He hasn't even confirmed how many chapters there are. Who knows where we're at? Although I do think by those episode cards that you've been releasing, there's going to be about like 6 games, maybe 5, if they can rush it a slight bit. He's been saying this from Shenmue 1. He clarified it in the lead up to Shenmue 3. Yeah, like this is not going to be the end, guys. Don't. Maybe don't walk in expecting that. Yet people are upset that we didn't defeat Lon D. Well, Rio's still a kid. I mean, he gets his butt handed to him by some fat dude in the village. You know what I mean? He's
Yeah,
not gonna
absolutely.
take on the Grand Master just yet. But I do think where the story excels is as a middle chapter to the story, because you find out so much new lore. You find out that Iwao and Londi trained together as children. You find out the creation of the mirrors and their relation to to the bridge. It's just all very deep and intricate weaving of this new narrative, this new fantastical element over a pretty grounded revenge tale. And I find it more interesting, personally, than some of what the earlier games were doing. Not necessarily the best one or anything. I think the characters of 2 are more affecting, maybe more memorable. Um, but yeah, I love 3 as a middle chapter to the game. I think what's so depressing about 3 is that it's currently the final chapter. We don't know when or what's up with 4, and maybe that's where a lot of the disappointment is coming from.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, all right. Let me frame a different. I'm jumping around the questions a little bit here, but it's a good follow up in my head. Obviously, with we don't know where Shenmue 4 is at the moment, but do you think people will judge Shenmue 3 differently when Shenmue 4 comes out, assuming that it does come out and moves the story forward and we start heading into those final chapters? Do you think Shenmue 3 will be more respected, if that makes sense?
Yes, I do, because it is a pretty necessary chapter in the story, all things considered. I mean, if you cut out Shenmue 3, I don't know. We Like I said, a lot of that lore between Iwao and Londi, but further from that, setting up Shenhua as like a major aspect of Rio's life. I mean, who's to say what she's going to be for him in the future? And
Yeah.
especially through the conversations that you have together, she asks him what he wants from the future. I think it gives him more to play with than just revenge in his life. He's got more to live for now.
Yes, and his friends and everyone around him. I think like you say, it's expanding outwards. So, did you spend the time and talk to Shenfire every night at her house, for example, and really dive into those conversations? Which some of those are some of the best I think you'll find across the series, personally.
So how I think a lot of people maybe played this game was rushing through the story, which maybe was not helped by the implementation of the wait function, which is kind of present in 2, where you can just kind of skip time and go forward back to her house and stuff. But it's not as strong as it is in 3, where you can pretty much just skip entire days. You don't have to do anything. So a lot of people were maybe being bested by the combat because they didn't train their horse stance every day or whatever. A lot of people didn't get the connection with Shenhua, so all they got was the perhaps awkward dialogue in between those sections where the best performances in the game are, yeah, like you said, between the 2 of them in those quiet nights. Yeah, I guess it just all comes down to how you play the game. I've always played the Shenmue series very slowly, discovering each room. And so when I was afforded that opportunity with this third game, it made me very happy. I wouldn't necessarily like the game if it was just one pure story with none of the surrounding world and elements grounding it. I wouldn't necessarily enjoy it as much. But obviously, it's much more expensive to craft these kind of worlds versus like a Telltale game version of Shenmue.
Which we could have got if the Kickstarter hadn't have raised the money that it did. I think that's probably where Shenmue 3 could have ended up, a very much a linear Telltale game style production, which those games are good, don't get me wrong, but I think Shenmue would suffer from that a little bit because, as you say, it's in the world, it's in the characters, it's in the mundanity of Shenmue.
Yeah, which doesn't sell. It doesn't. People want
No.
Yakuza and you know, the updated iterations of that formula, which offer more spice, I guess you could call it. And I understand that's a problem because how are you going to get the money to make another massive title like this for 4? And I'm sure all of us at this point would just be like, okay, fine, a Telltale game. We get to play it. Thank God. I just feel like the heart of Shenmue is lost with its open world.
Yeah. And yeah, I would agree. I think, as you say, money could be an issue, and we don't know where Shenmue 4 is currently in terms of anything with production announcements, anything we don't know. But
Yeah.
for me, if Shenmue lost its open world, I think it loses its soul. If it goes towards the like a Dragon Yakuza route and adds that spice and more fighting, etc., it loses its heart. And
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a Shenmue game anymore, for me at least, anyway.
So I have this pretty major argument that I don't think all games should be compared to modern standards. Tomb Raider in the 90s does control like jank today, right? Not
Absolutely.
great. But if you think about the game that you're playing, Tomb Raider 1 is all about navigating these tight environments using those controls. So it wouldn't work with like a smooth control system. Those levels are automatically invalidated, and that game was designed with that control system in mind. Modern games are all kind of amalgamating into Assassin's Creed 2, Batman Arkham. Now, those are great games, but does every single action game coming out today have to control like them? I don't think so. And personally, when comparing Shenmue 3 to Shenmue 1 and 2, I found it to be the perfect updating of that formula. It's just right. The camera
Mm,
is nice and smooth to control. Maybe I wish it was a little bit closer in on Ryu like the old days because you got those beautiful panning shots back in the day. But
yeah,
whatever. It's a very nice updating. Running felt good. It didn't it didn't feel as clunky as it used to, and I guess that's all we could ask for.
that's good, and probably not as clunky as before, but still clunky enough that it endeared itself in the right way, which I think we were all looking for. Moving into some of the presentation, we touched on this. What did you make of its visual presentation of Shenmue 3, and then sort of comparing it back to the originals?
This is definitely a double-edged sword aspect of the title, um, because it definitely suffers from the indie budget constraints. But on the good end of that sword, it has some of the most gorgeous environments I've seen in a game to this day. And it's absolutely stunning sometimes, from time to time, especially in Bailu when you're looking out over the mountains and all the birds are flowing down. You got the pink flowers flowing in the breeze, and yeah, it's really good. But then you turn the camera around onto Rio's face, and he just just looks so goofy. Um, I do feel like it's a pretty good updating of his character model. I'm more talking about like the lip sync issues with English.
Yeah,
I mean, that's gonna happen. That's there. Yeah, I find it to be a pretty much perfect reimagining of the original's art style. I wouldn't have necessarily liked a hardcore realistic. You can see the sweat pores on Rio's face. I wouldn't. He's an anime character.
fair. I like that. That's a very good comparison, actually. He's an anime character. So, moving away from sort of the graphics, the visual presentation, and like you say, the environments are absolutely amazing. They some of the best shots you'll find in gaming. The combat system, we've touched on this sort of on and off through our conversation. First off, did it work for you? And is there anything you change to it or want to improve with it?
It does work for me. I don't think it's a bad system on its own merits. It does obviously suffer again from those indie budget constraints. Things feel a little off. Your hits don't necessarily connect all the time. It's not terrible or anything, and it's definitely very fun. I found it to be fun, but more than that, I feel like this style of gameplay better fits the narrative of Shenmue, in the sense of you were never forced to train in Shenmue 1 or 2. You can go to the parking lots and you can train your moves, and it will get faster as you do them. And I could see where people are arguing that's better because it's up to you. It's like you're getting better at the moves uh, internally. But I don't know. There's something to say about actually making Rio have to train to get good. Like that's the whole point of the story. And the narrative of this game is he has to train, he has to get good, he has to 1-inch punch for 5 hours at a time. So that way, when he gets to Londi, he does the perfect 1-inch punch. That's how I interpret it, anyways. And further from that, the combo systems of this fighting system are really fun. They're really fun, especially once you actually learn how to use them and you're switching up different moves and you're throwing out crazy tiger crane kicks. And I think the main thing it's missing from the Virtua Fighter system is grapples. Obviously, that's the big thing people bring up, and yeah, I don't think this new system is as punchy or as enjoyable as the Virtua Fighter system. But were it updated and smoothed out, some better hit detection, better hit boxes, I think there's a lot of merits to this system.
Yeah, and something I'd agree with in its entirety. Once you get to know the system, get to know its quirks, how it works, you can string some really nice combinations together. And actually, I think the mocap for the moves themselves is excellent. Considering they shot it all in the Wisenet offices in a room not very big. They did a really good job of what they had. And actually, when you look at some of the mocap, when I think of some of the cutscenes, the end cutscene with Rio and Landy, and where Landy reaches his leg over Rio's hand and then kicks him in the face, that is so well choreographed and put together. And flows really well. There is absolute scope in that system for improvement. One thing I am going to ask you around the systems, QTEs, obviously they're a mainstay of Shenmue 1 and 2. How did you find the QTEs in Shenmue 3?
Now, okay, this is definitely one aspect that could have used updating from the old games. I'd say they're equally awful. Well, not necessarily awful. Okay, so the sequences with the QTEs are charming and they're fun, but the timing of the QTEs, especially if you have like some sort of accessibility issue, I can't even imagine how miserable of an experience those things are. As Shenmue fans, we've all gotten used to it. But yeah, they're comparable to the old games. I wouldn't say they're better or worse. They're about the same.
And did you find, I'm just interested because this is a common complaint with the QTEs in 3. Did you find they were really punishing in terms of the reaction time you had to input them compared to the originals?
I do think that the QTEs and Yu Suzuki maybe should have learned from 20 years of gaming in certain aspects. I don't think he should have watered down or diluted the direction of Shenmue. But definitely the game could have been made more accessible because that was his goal, right? That's why he made the combat tutorial just press any button, maybe R2 if you feel like it, buddy. Uh, his whole goal was to make it more accessible to a new generation of players, yet he added no accessibility options. He made the QTEs like insane to actually hit. I don't know. It definitely feels like a misstep to me to not make the game feel a bit smoother. But I can't tell how much of that comes down to the budget and how much of it comes down to Yu Suzuki's direction. I don't know.
That's an interesting question, I guess. I mean, the timing of the windows for the reactions, hands down needed lengthening out a bit. Maybe it's because I'm old these days and my reaction times aren't what they were, but they felt much tighter. So, like you say, from a accessibility standpoint, it does make things very difficult. And I that's the sort of thing that budget in my mind doesn't come into it. They can just widen the window in the code and away you go. I think wider accessibility, whether that was considered in the budget or not, I don't know. But where games are going these days, when you think of sort of the AAA stuff like God of War and games like that, where they have a vast plethora of accessibility options, that's surely got to be considered in a Shenmue 4, I would think.
Yeah, and it's very important in modern gaming in general. I mean, you never know who's going to pick up this title, and if they get to a point that they can't beat just because they are incapable of doing so, then that frankly that's definitely a flaw of design. It's just unfortunate. I never personally had too much of a problem of it. I definitely had to redo a few of them.
Yeah.
Um, which I have pretty fast reaction time, so I had to redo a few of them. That's not a great sign. I'm not trying to upsell myself or anything, but play a lot of Twitch games, Twitch shooters. So
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, I definitely see sections of this game where it's objectively flawed, and we could talk about that. Like I said, the tutorial for the combat system does not introduce how deep and effective it is, and it's not a perfect game by any means, but I do feel like it's pretty much a perfect continuation of the series. It's as good as we could have gotten.
Yeah, I would think so. And thinking of one of the positives with it, I'm going to go into the soundtrack now. What did you make of the Shenmue 3 soundtrack? Did it work for you?
Oh yeah, it's beautiful as always. I don't think I like it as much as I like 2. There's just something about 2's soundtrack. Oh man, I listened to that before I even played the game. I would just have that on my phone listening to it. The it's comparable. Just like everything else in this game, really, quality-wise, I feel like 99% of this game is comparable to the originals, faults and all, which I can see where people are coming from saying, oh, yeah, it just hasn't been fixed or anything. You never learned. But I don't know. Some of those faults are part of the charm of the series.
Going into some of the fan service, did you have a look around the safe Shenmue building? I saw you had a look at the notebook in Niaoui, for example. What did you make of all of the fan servicey bits from the Kickstarter?
Okay, it's very, very charming to me. And I'm sure to all the other fans who picked it up and got to read through that book and maybe put into the Kickstarter. Um, to a new gamer not attached to the Shenmue series, and you just pick up that notebook on the table, and you're like, why is this game talking about itself? This is such a weird fourth wall break. I could see how it's maybe a flaw. Also, Rio holding himself on a forklift in his hand. Yeah, it's definitely a little odd. But it's charming in its own way. I don't necessarily like it in the sense of it breaks the real world simulation aspect that I loved so much about Shenmue 1. I mean, Shenmue 1's detail is down to if it was raining on December 8th, 1986 in Dobita, it's raining in the game on that day. I mean, the level of detail in Shenmue 1 is absolutely next level even to this day. And I think it's maybe a misstep to take away that sense of immersion, to take away that sense of realism, because like they have new technology here that they could better realize that world, and instead we got maybe this caricature. But it is very charming. At the end of the day, also it's a silly Shenmue game.
Well, I think with Shenmue 4, hopefully not having to go down the Kickstarter route, they won't have that sort of fan servicey stuff in there. I think it was needed for 3 to a point, but they don't need it going forwards. Obviously, the capsule toys and things like that. I think if they don't have Rio holding himself in game, that probably wouldn't be missed too much. But those sorts of mini things, I think, will continue through. Just maybe potentially better implemented is the term I'm looking for. So, sort of coming into the final few little bits of this interview here. Have you got any advice for somebody picking up Shenmue 3 for the first time? They could be a new fan, they could be an old fan. What advice would you give them when they pick this up for the first time and begin to play it?
I am going to share the same bit of advice that a good few people in the comments shared to me. Forge your own opinion. You're gonna hear a lot of negativity surrounding the game, and some of it is valid. It's not a perfect game by any means, but not every game necessarily needs to be perfect. And if you love Shenmue and you love the series, I see absolutely zero reason you're not gonna in some way love 3. It has so much going for it for as a fan of that series, especially in the way it continues Rio's storyline and offers up great insight to the lore at large. Another piece of advice: look up tips on the combat system. Don't listen to the game.
True. Yeah.
Don't just mash. Look that up. It's unfortunate that you have to do that. Definitely a flaw, but the combat system is a ton of fun if you actually learn how to use it.
Okay, so moving away from Shenmue 3 a little bit, Shenmue 4, what are you hoping for from a fourth game when hopefully we get that game coming out in the not too distant future? What do you want from a fourth Shenmue game?
I'm gonna say straight off the bat, not the end. um, I wouldn't necessarily want to see it rushed. I've seen a lot of talk about maybe an episodic thing where four could just be the final one, but they release two parts of it or something like that.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting idea. I definitely want to see more story resolution. Not necessarily defeating Londi, but he could find more people close to his father, find more information about why him and Londi were training together, and what the Phantom mirrors are for, right? That's still a huge mystery. There's definitely a lot of unanswered questions, some of which could be answered in a fourth game. I just don't think he's ready to defeat Londi yet.
Well, here's a question: do you think he may never defeat Landy, and that it goes wider of him and Landy? It goes broader than that.
That is interesting because there is something fantastical being set up with these mirrors. There's definitely more than meets the eye here. That's a hard call there because I think as fans, the first thing we see is Lon D killing his father. I mean, we have to get that guy. We we have to get him. That's not right. But oh, that would definitely be interesting if he has to learn to let go of that instead.
Because it goes back to Shenmue 2 and Zhuing and basically telling him not to lose himself in his revenge like her brother Zimming did. And there's these parallels running there with vengeance and all of that. And it's almost like Rio needs to break that cycle. So it could happen in my mind that he doesn't defeat Landy and has to go wider of that.
I think we all want to see Rio prosper rather than get completely lost in this vengeance streak just to avenge his father, which is something Ewell probably wouldn't have even wanted in the first place. I sincerely don't know where Yu is going to take it from here. There's endless theories. I think what we all want from Shenmue 4 is a good game. I
Yeah.
mean, that's such a basic answer, but we want less turmoil within the franchise. We want to see a game that sells well. And I don't necessarily know what would do that because clearly three's design wasn't it, which I actually feel was influenced by factors other than the quality of the game. I know that I talked about the first hour and how maybe that impacted things, but a lot of the discourse around this game as it was coming out on the first couple of weeks of release was so widely negative. If you search Shenmue 3 on YouTube, well, you and me, we might get different results because we look that up all the time. We're going to get the weird
Yeah.
discussion lore videos. But if a normal guy searches Shenmue 3 on YouTube, he's going to get Shenmue 3 is terrible and I've wasted my life. That's like the number one pop up. And if a normal guy, sees that, I'm going to be like, oh, I guess Shenmue 3 is a terrible game and I don't need to play that.
Okay. Yeah, you are right. And that particular video I have issues with, but I won't talk about those here because I will go on a rant about that video for the next 20 minutes. But what I am going to put to you is with the fan community. Obviously, you're going back to your original Facebook post asking for comments around Shenmue 3. It's clearly divided, right? And I think that's fair to say. Do you think the community is almost shooting itself in the foot by not letting go of those things that some people are rightly negative about in Shenmue 3? I'm not saying it's a perfect game. It isn't a perfect game. We all know that. But do you think the community is almost turning people away, but by being so unwilling in some aspects or some corners to let go of Shenmue 3 and actually see the things it did pretty well, like the environments, like the depth of the combat system, and like Rio's growth with Shenfar? Do you think that the community is overlooking that and therefore almost impacting and putting new people off?
I do think that the general stigma against it is pretty unfair, and it's almost become like a popular thing. Like, oh yeah, just Shenmue 3 is the bad one. That's just, we all know that. Come on now. I think Shenmue 1 and 2 are maybe, like, obviously I love these titles. They're very near and dear to my heart. maybe they're held up a little too highly as like flawless masterpieces with nothing wrong with them. But anything that I've seen, most of the things I've seen listed as negatives towards Shenmue 3 typically exist in Shenmue 1 and 2 too. Also, I mean, if you want to talk about grindy, Shenmue 1 forces you to drive a forklift for like 5 or 6 hours, depending on how quick you do it. We've all gotten used to it, but yeah, it's just a part of the series. It's a charm of the series. You have to work a full-time day job in 2 frequently. Yeah, it's just always been a part of the series, and I guess I could see where people are coming from saying, "Oh, it should be modernized and those boring aspects should be taken out," but that would ruin the day in the life feel of it. It's not all about Ryu's quest for vengeance. It's about his life surrounding that.
That's a brilliant answer. Thank you very much. And my last question to close us for this interview, and Bailey, thank you for taking the time out of your day to join me. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and hearing a new person coming into Shenmue 3, sort of seeing it with their own eyes essentially, and blocking out all the discourse surrounding it and going, do you know what? Yes, there are flaws to it, but I love it anyway, and that's the whole thing with this Shenmue 3. There are flaws, but do you know what? I wouldn't change it. And I'm so glad it exists, because it could never have existed. And I'd rather be in a world we have it than don't. But do you have any final thoughts to leave us with? And what's your message to the Shenmue community now?
I sincerely love and appreciate all the fans who saw this release, as I'm sure you does, as I'm sure all the people involved do. This game was clearly, you can see it from the outset, even during the not so great first hour of the game. You can tell it's a game made with passion. They clearly cared about every single second they put into making this world, into making this journey. I think that just shines clearly the entire time you're playing it. I think as a Shenmue game, it's pretty much a perfect follow up, and I think it deserves maybe a second looking, a second chance. Yeah, it's pretty much a great middle chapter, and I hope that we get to see some storylines tie up with 4. Long live Shenmue.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bailey, for joining me. Everyone who's been listening to the interviews, the videos, etc., thank you for joining in with all the content that we're putting out. And we'll be back again with a podcast in a few weeks. But for now, guys, take care, have a good one, and I'll see you soon. All the best.